Well, thank you everyone for bearing with us on this one. The microphones are working, the presentation seems to be working, so we will continue. We just had to do a slightly different thing with the camera here, but we wanted to make sure that we get everything on the camera. So I'll start with introducing our panelists. So as you know, we are now within the metaphor and creativity theme, and I think we started it very well with being very creative with the camera, with just being risky, unpredictable.
It's a creative industry.
Yeah. And thank you everyone for being understanding. So I'm going to start with introducing Jeanette. So Jeanette, you probably all know, is a professor of English language and applied linguistics at the University of Birmingham. Her research focuses on metaphor and metonymy and explores the role these play in language education and cross-linguistic and cross-modal communication. And just a heads up, Jeanette has a new book coming out, Metaphors in the Mind with CUP. And then I want to introduce Giovanni Corazza, who is a full professor at the Alma Mater Studiorum University of Bologna, founder of the Maroni Institute for Creativity. Marconi, I'm so sorry. I do have a seat here. His research focuses on 5G communication networks, navigation and positioning, and creativity, of course. Elizabeth El Rafael is a reader at the School of English, Communication, and Philosophy. Her main teaching and research interests are in visual and multimodal forms of communication, with a particular focus on metaphor. And finally, Paula Teresa Brino is a lecturer in applied linguistics at Politecnica de Madrid. Her research focuses on multimodal metaphor in advertising. She works at a computer science school with other researchers working on artificial intelligence. So she's also interested in the role of computational creativity and what linguists can contribute to the discussions. I'm sure that this variety that we have here with our speakers is going to be great for the discussion. I just need the... Where is our clicker? Does anybody see it?
The clicker.
The clicker, yes. The thing that we used to...
Next to Elizabeth?
No.
Maybe just use the keyboard?
Yeah. Okay, so we'll start with the first question. So, as in the other panels, we're going to have all the panelists answering this. So we'll start with the question, what constitutes a good metaphor in terms of creativity?
Right, so I've been asked to start because I have a definition of creativity, so we thought we might start with that. Is the sound quality all right? Should I speak up a bit? Okay. Right, so I'd like to start with Ronald Carter's definition of creativity, and he defines creativity as something that is both novel and appropriate. So we could say then that a good metaphor in terms of creativity is one that fulfills both these criteria. So it has to be novel and it has to be appropriate. I think novelty is perhaps less difficult to determine. So we could say something is novel if it hasn't been used before in a particular context, or at least if it hasn't been used very often in a particular context. But I think appropriateness could be explored a little bit more. There again, I think it might be important to make a distinction between what we are intending to do with a metaphor. So if a metaphor is just intended for self-expression, then in a way it is appropriate if the person who is using the metaphor feels that it is expressing a thought or feeling in a way that feels right. So that's the only criterion, I would say, for appropriateness, if it's just for your own pleasure, in a way, for your own expression. However, if you're trying to communicate something, then I think appropriateness is only applies if it makes sense to the audience in some way. I think there are various criteria, again, for what makes a metaphor make sense to an audience. But two important ones, I think. One is that it needs to accord with our embodied experience in some way. So just to give a simple example, the idea that has been mentioned, I think, a few times in this conference, that vision is associated with knowledge. So because of our lived experience, we feel that when we can see something clearly, we also understand it and know about it. And so if we use a metaphor that describes wisdom in terms of poor vision or blindness, I think that perhaps wouldn't make sense to very many people. And similarly, I think a metaphor needs to also accord with people's more sort of social and cultural experiences. And that's then is more specific to particular audiences. So if you have, if you're using a metaphor, for instance, to describe a relationship that draws on a competitive sport, that might make sense to an audience in an individualistic culture, but may make less sense to a culture where people are more concerned about collectivist goals and aims. So that's, yeah, I'd like to maybe pass on to...
Okay.
Yeah, Giovanni, if you want to say something about...
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to the organizer for letting me be part of this very nice event. I'm going to take a wider angle on creativity, so let me explain what I mean by that. We, as humans, human species, we have culture, but we're not the only ones. All species have culture. We are the only ones, almost, with cultural evolution. And our culture evolves thanks to language and thanks to creativity that generates ideas that make our common knowledge grow. So from that point of view, a good metaphor, under this point of view, is a metaphor that has the potential to let the person that utters the metaphor or receives the metaphor generate ideas that then can be transformed into elements of knowledge in all possible domains. It could be art, it could be science, it could be technology. So from this point of view, metaphor becomes not only a way to express in writing or in speech, but also a tool for the generation of ideas. And I will return on this concept in a second question, because then I will be a little more precise on how we do that. But from this point of view, the novelty that we normally call originality and appropriateness or effectiveness is measured in terms of the impact of these ideas on the evolution of culture.
Yeah, I think to follow up from those two definitions, and also from the previous panel, I think we were talking about this before, and I think a good creative metaphor is a metaphor that does what its producer intended it to do in the context in which it was produced, and that's got to be kind of primary. And in support of that, Paola and I have done a couple of studies looking at. In both studies, we've asked people to assess the effectiveness or how much they appreciate particular metaphors. Two very, very different studies. So one looking at computer-generated metaphors and very completely decontextualized work, where people are given these random metaphors and asked to say how effective they are. And we found there, in that completely decontextualized task, in line with some of the stuff that's been reported here already, that metaphors are deemed to be really effective and good if the vehicle is has got more negative valence than the topic, and also if the vehicle is less frequent than the topic. So kind of the less is more idea that we were talking about before. Whereas in total contrast, when we've been looking at metaphor in advertising, we found that in fact, a more complex metaphor is one that's much more likely to be appreciated. So a metaphor that opens up a huge amount of potential for different interpretations. And so we found these differences already just in those two studies, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that was a very good recap. I'm going to give it a firecracker, and I'm going to join the team of people giving frustrating answers. And perhaps before we get into what's a good metaphor in terms of creativity, we should consider creative for whom? Is it creative from the perspective of the speaker, so the production of the metaphor? Is it for the analyst, so someone who's the observer? Or is it for the perceiver? I think that's something really relevant, and it might not be that what is good for one is good for the other. And so basically what Janet and I, we've been working on, it's on the perception of metaphor from the perspective of the hearer, or the person who's viewing a visual metaphor. And before we move on to some of the results, it should also be considered that not all the hearers are the same. So you might have people with varying cognitive abilities. You might have people who are beginners in a language, so not very proficient. Or a very interesting question, which is metaphorical for whom, that boils into specialized discourse. So some metaphors might be not even perceived as metaphorical for people with a lot of knowledge. And what I think is more interesting about everything, even though you might think you have like a balanced pool of participants for your experiment of aptness for metaphor, is that they don't even might have the same need for cognition or like willingness to decode a metaphor. But what we found in the past years of experiments is that it's true that more complex metaphors seems to be felt as more apt because they are richer, and apparently this is what people look for in a metaphor. Also, the fact that they're visual, they seems to be perceived as better, and they're usually preferred over verbal metaphors, and also more likely to change behavior and perceptions. And finally, we haven't talked much about metonymy, but I think this is crucial. So in our research, what we found is that either whether you have like a visual or verbal economic point of access to the metaphor, that seems to be perceived as something really good, because in a very economical and effortless way, you can access a metaphor, and then once you are engaged with that, then you just spend some time decoding it. And if you feel rewarding, therefore that is likely to be considered as good.
Thank you so much. I suggest we now switch to the second part. Okay, so this is one of the questions that one of our speakers will take. So the question is, to what extent and in what ways does the use of metaphors affect the originality of an utterance? And now we'll have to go through your slides.
Okay, thank you very much. So we can go to the first slide that, in a sense, is a presentation of this institute that is dedicated to Marconi, inventor of radio. So that is the villa in Bologna where Marconi was grown. He was not born there, but he grew there, and that's where the invention actually took place. So you're all invited. When you come to Bologna, please do come. And why did we found this institute, and what does this have to do with originality and metaphors? Essentially, we come from the industrial society where standards are at a prime, and our education system teaches standards. And you're the best student, and you have the highest grades if you show that you are brilliant, fast in answering questions about standards. But now we have introduced technologies, and I take part of the blame for that, that has transformed society so that instead of standardization, we have personalization, user profile, user-driven design, technology which is adaptive to your needs. And we have networks that allow us anywhere we are, like in this room, to be connected to the rest of the world and to all the knowledge databases in the world. Which means that we are standardizing knowledge. That is a trend. It's not true today, of course. We are extending our mind out of our brain, essentially, thanks to this technology. And now our distinction as humans becomes related to things that everybody else cannot have access to yet. Therefore, creativity becomes a necessity for everyone, and it's not geniuses that are creative, but everyone must be creative. So this is why we need an institute to transform creativity into a discipline. And in the future, not too far, we have hyper-connectivity and hyper-intelligence. What is the role of the human in the collaboration with the machine? It's not technical, it's not literal, I would say. It's the metaphoric essence of what we can give in this collaboration, which will be important. The human side, that's what we have to cultivate. And therefore, what you are doing is not only important for linguistics, It's important for the survival and the organic life of the human species in the future. That is the reason why we've done that. The next slide is a model that we dedicate this year. As you know, it's the 500th anniversary of Leonardo da Vinci. He died on the 2nd of May in 1519. So in the 2nd of May we will have this 500th anniversary, and so our model for the creative thinking process is dedicated to Da Vinci, and you see there's an acronym there that goes through the 5 mental states. These are 5 mental states. I will not go into the details, but the yellow line around some of these components of the creative thinking process, that's the place where metaphors can play a role, which means in multiple parts of the creative thinking process. In drawing inspiration, the source becomes an inspiration. In finding interpretations, so divergent novelty generation, and in extracting the value of the ideas, in imagining all possible scenarios, all possible conditions in which the idea can be used. Next. We use normally metaphors that no one has seen before. They're not nice, they're not literal, they're not, you would not use them in poetry, and their only use is to create a world, a state of mind that you have never experienced before, and hopefully nobody else in the human species has ever experienced before. So you're out of the common knowledge domain. When you bring together two entities that normally are not together, and should not be together, that's a good starting point. Now the exercise doesn't end there. You now have to work back into the common knowledge domain. Extract meaning, interpret. Apply hermeneutics not to the Bible, but to finding meaning for metaphors. And in this way back, this is when originality is created, essentially. Let me give you an example which is very simple. You wake up every morning, you go to work, and you normally take the shortest route, always the same route. But tonight you go back home, you get kidnapped and brought somewhere that you've never been before, blindfolded. You wake up tomorrow, you still want to go to work because you're so committed. It's Sunday, you've been kidnapped, but you want to go. And it's going to take long, and you're going to have many tries, but in the end you will succeed. Now what is the probability that doing this exercise now you found the new route? It's essentially 1. So if you're able to generate in your mind a state that you've never visited before, and a posteriori give meaning to that state, you have generated a new idea in your mind. Is that a new idea for the entire species? We don't know. Is that a valuable idea? We don't know. But that's the start of the process. The last slide is that for any entity, as Pierce has told us, we have infinite possible meanings, and so the art of this process is the ability to foresee all possible futures, all possible attributes, all possible functions of the ideas that you generate, and it's a never-ending process. So a good metaphor opens up, a nonce metaphor opens up all these possibilities of exploration of vast spaces, which are initially outside of the common knowledge domain, but then you have to come back. It's an orbit, essentially. You don't remain out of the common knowledge, otherwise you're just saying things that don't make any sense. This is, in a very, very short nutshell, the philosophy or the principles under the methodology that we developed and that we teach in school, university, business schools, and apply also in companies. So what I'm saying is that your role, your ability to work with metaphors, your understanding, the analysis can also be used in practical applications, also with companies, and this becomes crucial in the future. So thank you for what you're doing.
We'll now have a question for Jeanette. What is the role of intentionality in production and interpretation of creative metaphor?
Thank you. Yeah, this question relates to the idea that I think something we haven't discussed all that much in the last couple of days, and also doesn't tend to have come up much in the research into creative metaphor. Is there a difference between a creative metaphor and just a novel metaphor? Is there something about a metaphor that makes it creative, or is just any kind of random things that are put together a novel metaphor? Is that instantly creative? And one thing that I one idea, one possibility is that with creativity, you've got perhaps some idea of intentionality. So somebody intended to be creative with that metaphor, or perhaps somebody intended to do something with that metaphor, which resulted in them producing something that was creative. But this idea of intentionality is perhaps a bit problematic. There's a few metaphors on the screen here. You just have a look at those for half a minute or so. Yeah, I think if you look at them, they're kind of nice metaphors, they're quite creative metaphors. They certainly, it's quite easy to find meaning in them, even though some of them are perhaps a little bit odd. But then if I tell you that the first of these metaphors are all produced by people in different situations. So the first metaphor is produced by someone who has synesthesia, and synesthesia is a condition where people automatically make connections across the senses. They can't stop making those connections across the senses. And in some ways, that idea that the colour of sound is a terribly obnoxious baby blue is kind of almost literally true for someone with synesthesia. So to what extent is that creative? The second one is produced by somebody with schizophrenia during an interview where he was asked why it is he's got an aversion to eating and why it is he can't eat. And this is his explanation of why he finds it really difficult to eat. So again, how it kind of puts the metaphor in a new light in terms of like how creative it is and how much that person intended it to be creative. The third one is a metaphor from mine and Paula's study on computer-generated metaphors, so no intentionality there because it was created by a computer. The fourth one sounds like a bell, and this one sounds like when you're dead. This is a study that we're doing with very young children, aged 4 to 6, asked to interpret or explain the difference between musical chords. So this is a major and a minor chord. So again, this is produced by like a 5-year-old. So did he really mean this, or was he being creative? And the final one comes from a study that we're doing, talking to civil servants who work for the UK Civil Service, asking them to describe their working environment. And in the civil service, one of the things we found in our study is that there are a huge number of like family metaphors. People grow up in the civil service. You kind of like you're weaned, etc. There are lots of metaphors from that semantic field. So given that semantic field is so common, maybe baby people is nice, but maybe it's a little bit less creative because it just draws on a semantic field that's common in that context. So this kind of ties a little bit back to what Paula was saying about how, whose creativity and where is the creativity, and do we have a natural inclination to infer intentionality when we come across a creative metaphor? And then sort of related to that is the idea that when people produce creative metaphors, and we were talking before with Zoltan about how there's kind of there's different ways of being creative. There's elaboration within the source domain or the frame, or there's bringing together two different domains. But when we look at kind of metaphor in kind of like in the wild, we have a bit of a mess when we look at what people are producing. So this example is from the civil service data, and this guy is talking about his boss, who he obviously didn't like very much, and he says she did the traditional chuck it all up in the air, so get all the deck chairs and throw them up in the air, cause chaos for a year and a half, then leave, and that's basically what she did. This is quite interesting because you've got the idea of this kind of throwing things in the air, and you can relate that to a conventional mapping, but this deck chairs, that resonates back to this idea we have in English, this expression of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So like the Titanic's going down, I'm not going to make any references to the political status at the moment, but the whole thing, the whole ship is going down, and people are just rearranging the deck chairs. So I don't know whether I think that is kind of in there, certainly when you try and interpret it, that reference to deck chairs, it hasn't come from nowhere. But did this person intend to make a reference to that explicitly? Did it just come to him? And I think that this is something with creativity. A lot of it is so subconscious and so quick when you get it in day-to-day interaction that it's not always a neat mapping or a neat association within a source domain. And then related to that is the thing that Herb was talking about before, about like the relationship between metaphor and humour. This is an example from a study where I was doing, where a colleague was talking to different people about her job and about different styles of management within her department. And she had this kind of framework where she had this kind of matrix where she was talking about different styles of management, and she was illustrating each one with a different one of her former bosses, which is quite interesting. I was really surprised that she was happy for this to be recorded. So she had these, this is this is the Jim Jones section, or this is the whatever section. And then they start to talk about their current boss. So she's got this diagram on a flip chart, and she says, I'm not sure where Charles is. And then the interlocutor says, he's on a holiday at the moment, as usual. And then she says, he doesn't appear on the map at all, he's just sort of gone right in and come out the other side. And then they both laugh. And I think that, again, is like, you can sort of see there's a bit of elaboration there within a source or within a frame, but it kind of almost goes way beyond it, because what on earth does that actually mean? It's a metaphor that it's really hard to pin down what is actually meant by that. But they get it, they get the humour before they perhaps get the actual meaning. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about a little bit, with the intentionality and creative metaphor. Oh, sorry.
Yes, but I would just ask you to sort of sum up.
Sorry, okay, yeah. So basically this very last point is creative at the level of form, creative at the level of meaning, or creative at the level of form? So is it about being creative in terms of bringing together different ideas, or is it playing around with the linguistic form of the metaphor? And I would argue that the two are almost impossible to disentangle. So this one at the top, this is very much about meaning. This is again from the civil service. So this guy describes his job as being on a soapy conveyor belt with people throwing wet sponges at him, etc. That's almost very deliberate, bringing together two domains. But then you've got kind of various issues, like the supertanker one is kind of elaborating or bringing in hyperbole to a very conventional mapping. You might grow up in defence, have finance thrust upon you. That's a reference back to Shakespeare. Some are born great, some become great, some have greatness thrust upon them. So there's that coming in there. Once you have the dream job, the nightmare starts, you've got dramatic contrast, so you've got mixtures. And then the final one, a Kirby kiss. I think there might be a thing that comes through with that. Is there a... Yes. So basically, Kirby, I'm hoping there's nobody from Kirby here, but it's a town very close to Liverpool, where near from where I'm from, and a Kirby kiss is quite a rough town, and a Kirby kiss is a headbutt. So there you've got like the constraint with the alliteration coming into the metaphor. So you've got a real mixture here of meaning and form. And so I just end with the idea, are we talking about creative metaphor, or are we talking about being creative with metaphor? Are they two different things? Are they kind of overlapping constructs?
Thank you so much, Jeanette, and thank you for not mentioning the B word when speaking of the political situation. And now we're going to move to Elizabeth with the question, can visual metaphors also become conventionalized, sleeping or dead metaphors?
Yes, I think actually it follows on quite nicely from what you were saying at the end, because now we're sort of looking at the level of expression. So you can have a metaphorical idea that's expressed either in language or it can be expressed in other modes as well. So just to reiterate, when we talk about generally in the literature, when we talk about sleeping or dead metaphors, we're talking about the expressions in a particular language that have become so conventional that people no longer process them at a conscious level, or at least, they can sometimes be reawakened in certain contexts, but in general discourse, people would use them without being aware necessarily that they're metaphorical. But this also obviously interacts with the conceptual level, because very often the most conventional expressions are based on entrenched conceptual mappings. So just to give an example, if we think of the way that gravity works on our bodies, and that is correlated in our experience very often with not being able to resist gravity is when we're tired or sick or unhappy, and so it feels very natural to talk about being down or downbeat or feeling run down or whatever. My first answer to the question, can visual metaphors be dead or sleeping in this sense? First of all, I would say the most straightforward answer is no. And I would say for two reasons. First of all, unlike language, with visual metaphors, for instance, if you think about down, it always has to be someone or something that has to be down. So it's always more specific in some way. Also, the visual mode is more is sort of continuous and infinitely graded, unlike language, which sort of consists of units. If we could maybe have the first example. So the examples I'm going to give are all from graphic novels or graphic memoirs about mental health problems, mood disorders. And this one is from Ellen Forney's a book called Marbles, and she's describing here how the different states in her mood, and she's comparing that to a sort of traditional carousel with wooden horses mounted on poles. And so the different states, depression and euphoria and so on, are not just the movement of the horses up and down on the pole, but also the posture and behavior of the rider, which is the woman. So with depression, she's curled up under her horse, and euphoria, she's sort of touching the ceiling. So in this sense, I think in the visual mode, it's much more difficult for something to become conventionalized, because each time somebody wants to express a mood disorder through a spatial metaphor, it has to be something or someone that is down, and it has to be more or less down in some way. Could we have the second example? So again, this is another graphic memoir about depression, and here the autobiographical narrator has just been admitted to a mental institution. She's had a real breakdown, and I think what's interesting about this is, although it doesn't have an explicit pictorial metaphor, I would say it's very much using the idea of depression as being down, and here being down is actually translated into three different ideas in a way. So we have, on the one hand, we have her in the story world lying on the bed, so in that sense she's down. The bed is also in the bottom right-hand corner, and we have these three blocks of text which lead the eye from the top diagonally down the page. And then we also, as a viewer, we are sort of looking down at her, so there's also a sort of interpersonal dimension to her being down in relation to us, the viewer. So again, and then we also have the darkness metaphor, obviously, which is another, in language, a dead metaphor, really, or a sleeping metaphor. If we say that was a dark period of my life, you know, it's so conventional that maybe we don't particularly see it as metaphorical. However, if we could maybe have the third example.
And we could just wrap up.
Yeah. So that this is, I am finishing now. I would say, as a caveat to my answer that visual metaphors can't become sleeping or dead, I would say that within certain genres, that there are certain visual metaphors that do become quite cliched in a way, and so for instance, a lot of these books about depression, they use sort of these blank panels that are all black or sometimes all grey. Sometimes it's a whole page that's all black to indicate, you know, something that you can't express that's so traumatic or so difficult. So we have there, they've got the word darkness written in it, but sometimes it really is just a blank panel. And the other example, just in this case, is drawings where people's spectacles or cover their eyes so that we can't see a person's facial expression, and that has slightly different meanings in different contexts. But usually it either represents, somebody's reluctance to show their emotions, or it can also indicate somebody's blindness to other people's suffering, so lack of empathy.
Thank you. So we have now covered sort of multimodal metaphors and their ability to become non-creative or stay creative. We have covered how intentional creativity is going to be. But now I'm going to ask you, Paola, to say something about in what ways can computer-generated metaphors help us understand the role of creativity in metaphor?
Good. Well, I think I will start by trying to frame where this question comes from and why we should be interested in this. So perhaps have lots of animations, I'm afraid. So this was my question, and everything begins when it's been haunting me for quite some months now, ever since I read in the newspaper about a team in the University of Seville who taught a machine to play flamenco. Yeah, a computer. And I hope this is not because we're running out of musicians, but this was an exercise. It was an exercise. So apparently that was super interesting because flamenco lacks regularity. So teaching a machine a non-patterned, set of meaning, and that was a big challenge. They said that teaching a machine how to do something is another way to study that output. And that's why I think that since we have computer-generated metaphors, that could be another source of information for us to learn new stuff about metaphors. Because after we've been talking about metaphor for 40 years, we seem to know pretty much about it. But yeah, there's still something perhaps that we can still do about it. So now we have some examples, just in case you're not familiar with this. So this one comes from metaphor Zoom. I just highlighted, there are several metaphors, so I have highlighted this one. A boundary is the food of a skirt. The next one comes from a Twitter bot, a metaphor a minute. A bone set is a burrito, funereal yet slumberous. And a third one, most longbows are tense, but others are as tense as a beach. So basically, what computer scientists involved in creativity do is they model a metaphor more or less like a blend. So they draw from a generic space, which can be WordNet or Google or any database. Then they contrast to input spaces like the burrito and the bone set, and they produce an emergent space, which is this tweet. Yeah? So if you click now, in a sense, this is a huge achievement because a machine is able to produce something new or novel that wasn't programmed to, and that the computer scientist is not able to reverse engineer. And this is basically what means passing the Ada Lovelace test. Ada Lovelace test, which is a machine can create something new that humans cannot explain or reverse engineer. But so coming back to this first notion of what makes a good metaphor and what counts as an apt metaphor, these three metaphors were basically rated as not good metaphors, or similar ones to this, in our study. So apparently humans have a very clear idea of what counts as a good metaphor and what counts as not a good metaphor. So again, and in the spirit of trying to be helpful, this is my question, is what we can do as linguists to improve improve these metaphors in the sense that is counted as a better metaphor. So before I come into the answer of this question, if we go to the next slide. So we have a clicker now.
Yes.
Excellent. I just figured that perhaps we need a little help of our friends, the linguists, yeah?
Try it.
Works,
yes.
Yeah? So perhaps before we start discussing what can we learn from computer-generated metaphors, we need a little help from the linguists. Because we have a large set of tools that come from linguistics and cognitive sciences that could help computer scientists to make more apter or better metaphors. So something really relevant here is that artificial intelligence is not meant to resemble human intelligence, it's just meant to simulate it. A very interesting way to simulate human intentionality, so picking up on what you just both mentioned, is the use of semantic affective norms. So we have a large set of concreteness norms, valence norms, familiarity, imaginability, and so on and so forth. So for example, if we introduce in the algorithm to generate metaphors the notion of concreteness, we could perhaps find more concrete source domains, which seem to resemble or connect better to the way we humans produce metaphors. If we use valence norms and we introduce them in the algorithm, we could perhaps keep the same positivity or negativity evoked by, there's a random text. and so on. Another area that I think we as linguists could do, or could help for, is to add more constraint on the source-target mapping. So the previous metaphors, what they had in common is that they combine crazy, well, they were crazy combinations of two inputs, right? The burrito and the bone set. But after, as I said, after 40 years of metaphor research, we know that there is some sort of preferred sources that map onto some preferred target domains. And we've been talking about MetaNet, MetaLud. We have n-grams, and I think it's very interesting what the mapping metaphor project at the University of Glasgow do. So they have this very nice visualization of what are the most relevant mappings from a diachronic perspective. So I think these are very useful tools that could help to inform these algorithms to create better metaphors. And finally, so this is something that emerged from one of our discussions. I'm working with, as I said, with a research team of artificial intelligence experts, and they just think, just because you can map two topics in the same paragraph, that must be a metaphor. So something we do know is that not just because you have two ideas in the same paragraph, that's an analogy. So there can be multiple relationships between these two ideas that should also be included in this computer generator algorithm. So what I think is relevant is that it shouldn't just be necessary to pass the Ada Lovelace test of creativity, but also the Turing test for humanness. And to the extent that what a computer can produce could be more or less resembling what humans produce. And just coming to an end, coming back to my question, what can we learn from creative metaphors? So, well, we can learn how to model creativity. So that can be helpful for interpretation. In my research team, we sometimes work with ontologies. In computer science, an ontology is a graphic representation of an idea, its concepts, and its relationships. So we're just wondering, if we were able to map two ontologies, like let's say an ontology for love and an ontology for travels, if we're able to map them, we would all, well, and it's possible, we would also be able to see how much overlap there is. And that would help to put an answer to this I find it's very vague, this assertion that metaphor is a partial correspondence between two domains. So if we were able to map these two ontologies, we would be able to know whether it's 50%, it's 70%. We would also be able to know whether, what's this threshold for optimality that Rachel here mentions, or what is, or whether like if it's like over 70 or 80% of correspondence is too boring, and that's not necessary. So I think quantifying the correspondence between source and target domains, that could be super helpful. That's something we can do with artificial intelligence. Another thing we could do, we could be able to detect fake metaphors. If linguists provide computer scientists with golden standards as to what counts as a human-apt metaphor, then we could be able to automatically raise red flags when something doesn't sound much as coming from humans. Yeah? And that would be, because now there's no way to do that fairly automatically, so that's something, I think it's a nice area for research in the future. And finally, I find it very interesting that sometimes we try to find a metaphor that rules them all, but as I said, there are different types of speakers. So, besides this idea of different needs for cognition and different type of experts, I'm just briefly going to talk and close my intervention with a study we're starting that has to do with easy-to-read methodology. So I'm not really sure whether you're familiar with this, but this has to do with adapting complex text to people with varying cognitive abilities. Yeah? So it's interesting because one of the instructions is to avoid metaphors whatsoever. Yeah, because they involve abstract reasoning and some people are not able to process that. But if there's something we do know after 40 years of metaphor research is that we cannot really speak without metaphors. Yeah? So interesting enough, we still need to know whether is it obscure creative metaphors or resemblance metaphors that we need to avoid? Is it just the linguistic expression that is complex, or is it that we need more primary metaphors in this text? Yeah? So ultimately, if linguists can inform and help computer scientists, we could be able to automatically adapt like poetic texts or complex text for these people to access a much wider range of information. Yeah? So I think that's it.
So having spoken about computer-generated metaphors and what they can tell us actually about how we as humans create metaphors, having spoken about visual metaphors, I think now it's a good time to, and having spoken about what creativity is, which is something that we started with, and it is a good time to switch to the next question. So, and we did mention this during these 2 days already, and as you mentioned, it seems like these 2 days have led up to this in many, many different ways. So the question is, are there different degrees of creativity in metaphor? And even though the question might seem very straightforward, please do elaborate your views on this.
Okay, thank you. Okay, going back to this point of view of metaphor used to generate ideas, the degree of creativity in metaphor is related essentially to the semantic distance between the target and the source. And the question is there an optimal distance which generates higher potential in the interpretation of the metaphor, which is not in real time. It's a slow process. One way to answer that is looking at the fact that the ideas that you generate have impact in the future. In the futures, there are possible futures, plausible futures, probable futures, and preferable futures. So you decide what kind of future trends you want to introduce, and one way is to generate an idea which is a high potential, high degree of creativity, is to use as a source of inspiration in the metaphor a trend. You can use it as it is, you can use a reversal of the trend, so you're assuming that in the future things will go in the opposite way as they look like they are going today, or you can transform these trends in very different ways. So this is one approach of building metaphors that require work to extract the meaning and that have high potential for high creativity in terms of ideas, which by that we mean high originality and effectiveness. In terms of linguistic, in real-time expression and writing, I will leave it, of course, to my friends who know much more about that.
Not sure about that. Yeah, so I think we've got that idea of kind of kinds of creativity talking about the distance between the source and the target, and also the extent to which the source domain is manipulated or elaborated. And I think, just maybe a couple of things to add to that. Maybe you've got a Klein, or maybe a kind of like a messy Klein, so maybe not a straightforward Klein, but a kind of quite complex Klein in terms of the degrees of constraint and the types of constraint, because I think creativity results from originality and constraint. Also maybe a Klein from kind of like meaning-based creativity to form-based creativity, with kind of pure versions of each at either end. A Klein from creative metaphor to creative use of metaphor, and maybe even a Klein of like intentionality, so like a Klein, you know, if someone intends to just sort of do something, perform a particular communicative function, through to perform creativity to actually perform a creative metaphor as another possible way of thinking of a Klein.
Anybody else have anything to add?
I
Yeah?
think we were hoping to talk to the other.
To pick up
The other question? Okay.
This is not prepared.
Well, we already started with the next one, sort of speaking through visual metaphors, and we've touched on many different multimodal metaphors throughout the 2 days. So the next question is, do some nonverbal modes, such as music and art, offer more scope for creativity than verbal language? You want to start, Elizabeth?
Okay. So I think, so my answer would be that there aren't any modes that are intrinsically more creative than others. However, I do think that each mode offers unique opportunities and constraints in a way. And one way of approaching this theoretically is through the notion of affordances, which is originally Gibson's term, but was then taken up by social semioticians. And social semioticians, what they mean by it is, on the one hand, what the actual material qualities of a mode allow us to do. So whether, for instance, if something is sequential or not sequential, for instance, that makes a real difference to what we are able to do or not able to do. And secondly, what in a particular culture or particular social group, what we have learned to do with a particular mode, or what we habitually do with that mode or don't do. I've given already, I think, an example of how I believe the visual mode is better able to express degrees of spatial orientation, for instance. But we might say that verbal modes or sequential modes in general are perhaps better at expressing actions relating to descent, where it's something that happens in a sequence, for instance. So that would be one example. I would say that the one thing that where we could perhaps say there's more potential for creativity is once we start putting modes together. So I think multimodality offers more potential for creativity simply because the meanings are not simply added together. That's what multimodal theorists would say. They're multiplied in a way. And just to give one example, there's a very nice magazine ad for tourism in Australia, and it basically shows a very expansive landscape, and in the middle of nowhere there's this table set up for very formal diners and waiters waiting around for people to come, and the tagline is, "So where the bloody hell are you?" And the way it's written, it's sort of written across half of the image, and it's written in what clearly could have only been produced by hand and by a very sort of loose, casual way of writing. The letters are all in different sizes and different shapes, so it's very individualistic, and both the individual letters, the words, and the lines are very widely spaced. So this gives the idea, I would say, of both the landscape and Australian people being sort of expansive and generous, and the viewer of the advert is being invited to sort of join this generous spirit of the landscape and the people in a way. So yeah, that would be my example of multimodal creativity.
Ella?
Well, I think I'm just going to paraphrase because that was like the perfect answer. Initially I would think that because non-verbal modes are less constrained than verbal language, they have more scope for creativity. But then that's not entirely true. So I agree that the combined view or combination of different modes is what actually leads to the bonus, the full creative meaning. So from my experience working with music, what I found is that it's true that music is very evocative and is able to bring lots of emotions at once, but only if it's, I'm talking about programmatic music, yeah? So music that is telling a story. Only if it's constrained somehow by few words, like Peter and the wolf, the cat is climbing the tree. The music allows for a very condensed way of conveying meaning. It tells you how fast the cat was climbing, how high the cat was climbing, whether he fell, whether he was happy, whether he was tense, whether he was stressed out, in a much more condensed unit than the paragraph that would describe the whole situation. About fine arts, I'm not going to say anything because I really know nothing about it. I actually don't know whether the lack of purpose, as in advertising, for example, that actually has to do something with this. But from advertising, yeah, it's true that the combination of modes actually allows for very creative combinations. I'm going to wrap up with something very interesting that Janet and I were talking about it the other day. We're encountering some adverts for a study we're doing that were based on optical illusions. And it's something that we've been thinking for quite some time, because in the previous study that we were doing, adverts based on optical illusions, they took longer reaction time, so people took longer to understand what they meant, but they were highly, highly appreciated. So we were wondering what's special about this. What we think is special about them is that at the form level, so connecting to with what both were saying, they're very basic, so they're very, very schematic. But then once you get into this advert, then there is a wide array of possible interpretations that might be relevant, that made you, or actually force you to revisit what this schematic visual representation was about. I'm going to give you an example, and then I will pass the microphone. We have an advert for Post-it notes, and it's black, just black, and there are 4 yellow squares, which looks like a window. So I already told you it was about Post-it, but it's not very apparent from the beginning because it appears very small in the corner. So you see a window in the night, and you just think, yeah, perhaps it has something to do with glasses. Yeah, we don't really know. So then you need to look carefully at that, and you see that in one little corner there's something. There's a note, handwritten note, that says "Buy light bulbs." Yeah, and then you realize these were not schematic representation of a window. It's a very realistic representation of 4 Post-it notes put together. Once you notice that, then you realize, okay, so the Post-it note is telling you to buy light bulbs so that this looks like an actual window. Yeah? So we think that, because of what respondents say in this experiment, is that once you have a very schematic visual representation that, again, economically gives you access to a metaphoric scenario, you end up in that scenario, you start decoding or interpreting that metaphor, and you end up with this wide array of propositions, and which in the end brings you back to this visual representation, and you just recontextualize that in a way that it was intended. Yeah?
Thank you so much. So before we go to our question that's sort of going to wrap up the entire panel, and before we start the question and the Q&A session, so I just want to sort of mention something that you mentioned something about sort of how in different cultures we also have a way of how we sort of do creativity, and it might be connected to the culture and the way we kind of rehearsed it. Well, that's not the words you use, but something like that. So I was thinking of maybe when we speak of nonverbal modes and verbal modes, maybe depending on what kind of culture it is. So like some cultures do not have written literature, so they have verbal literature. So maybe they would be more creative in a verbal way than maybe in the sort of multimodal way. But speaking of that, let's go to our last question.
Before we do that, can I say a little quick thing about the previous one?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that when we measure the performance in creativity, we have standardized tests, some of them for divergent thinking that can be proposed in both verbal and non-verbal modes. And there is a correlation between the results of the performance that you get in the 2 modes, but small. So you can be good in one mode and not good in the other mode. That's perfectly normal. And also in terms of lifetime achievement, we see that it's very rare that somebody is excellent in more than one modality. With, again, the exception of Leonardo da Vinci, I have to say that because he worked in more than 20 different disciplines, achieving the most famous painting in the world, the most famous fresco in the world, inventing things that would have come hundreds of years later. So, except for Leonardo, it's normally you excel in one of the modalities and not all of them.
That is really interesting because there are individual differences then as well. Okay, so the final question. So are speakers of different languages creative in different ways in their metaphor use? Who would like to start? Jeanette, maybe?
I think kind of what we were saying before about how the language, what Lisa was saying about how languages have different affordances, and you can do different things with different languages. So we've got examples like, let's say, in Japanese, there's lots of onomatopoeia that may feed into creative metaphor use. I'm thinking of perhaps one example in particular that maybe is a little bit different is so American Sign Language, where you can use like a container metaphor. You can adjust the hand shape to show the different type of container, because you can have like, so you can say more, you can provide more rich information about the container. The flip side of that is a thing called the double mapping constraint. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, but the idea that in sign languages, sometimes it's very difficult to not convey the rich information. So, for example, like the consuming knowledge is kind of eating, consuming ideas metaphor. That maybe doesn't always work that well in some sign languages, because you always have to have you have to encode the manner in which the food is being consumed, and then that kind of maps across and messes up the kind of more schematic idea of knowledge is consuming. So that's just an example, I think.
Thank you so much. Elizabeth?
Yes, I just thought what I was going to talk about fits in quite nicely. So again, I haven't actually done any research in this area, sort of cross-linguistic metaphor use. So I'm only speaking really from my own experience as a German speaker, and I'm always quite interested in how different forms of word creation, different languages might influence metaphor creativity, and in particular in German, compound words or compound nouns, where you're basically taking two or more words and sticking them together to create a new word. And German is, of course, famous for some of these words, and I mean, some of the examples that you might know, some in fact have been adopted into English. So the ohrwurm, which is the earworm, for instance, I've heard that being used quite a lot. But there's some that you might not be as familiar with. So there's one that's not a new one, is Torschlusspanik, which is literally the gate shut panic, or it means, you know, the fear that you're missing out and that time is running out to achieve something, or to. So I think that one apparently comes from the Middle Ages, when medieval peasants were trying to get into the city walls before the fall of darkness, and before they were going to be sort of killed by marauding enemies or whatever. But it gives this sense of the closest equivalent would be a midlife crisis, I suppose, but it's a lot less specific, so it can be applied to lots of different areas. And I just found a couple of newer ones, which I thought they might be quite entertaining. So there's one which is Chefwitzlacher, which is literally the boss joke laugher, which I don't think I have to translate. And there's another one which is that's quite cultural, so it's Landungsklatscher, which is someone who claps when a plane lands. And I don't know if you've ever been on a plane with a lot of Germans or Austrians, and kind of thought, why are they clapping? And another one that's also a bit similar is Sauna Untensitzer, which is literally somebody who in the sauna would sit right at the bottom because they're not tough enough for the really hot upper part. But I think the flip side of this is that sometimes, so one of my, when I was doing my PhD, I was looking at metaphors of relating to immigration in Austrian media. And what I found was that some of the really quite harmful metaphors relating immigrants or asylum seekers to floods, for instance, that they tended to be, when they were first used, so for example, they were talking about the Kurdenschwemme, which is literally a flood of Kurds, and initially it was still with a hyphen, so it was kind of becoming, you could see it becoming a compound, and then some of the more common terms, just refugee waves or refugee floods, they were written as one word. And what I found was that they were becoming, really sleeping and dead metaphors, in the sense that people who were critical of the xenophobic discourse seemed to be using these words as if they were, the common sense way of talking about asylum seekers.
Thank you so much. I think both of these two responses really show how language typology can actually influence the different ways we can be creative in when we're using metaphors. Paula, do you want to this one?
Just for the sake of discussion, I fully agree with that. But for the sake of discussion, I would just give a different example of how all languages can be creative in the same way. And I've been very interested in the past years, interested in the use of iconicity patterns in branding. Yeah, because, iconicity I find it fascinating, the fact that one specific linguistic and cultural context can have this iconicity pattern that seems very culturally entrenched, that then it can be understood in a similar way in the opposite side of the world. So a very famous example in branding is Ruffles, the Ruffle crisps. And there is a very fun TV, it's a TV commercial that says Ruffles. So not just because I can roll the R's, like everyone can actually understand that these are Ruffle crisps instead of the light ones, so I don't know. And we're now looking into something, because sometimes it's a bit Western-centric, these examples. So we're looking now into something slightly different. We're looking into a branding strategy in South Korea to promote schnapps, soju. So Koreans, they do two sounds. So they say "kya" and "k," depending whether they're women or men. Yeah. So we thought this was very culturally entrenched. Like, so for some reason, parents teach children what they should say when they bring schnapps. That was really strange. But then we put these sounds to Americans, and now we're doing it with Germans and Spanish as well. And everyone is able to project not just what, well, I forgot to say, soju used to be quite alcoholic, like 40% or something like that. But then there was a ban on TV commercials, and only alcoholic drinks below 17% were able to appear on TV. And therefore what they did, they basically put some water and lowered down the alcoholic percentage. So now it's lighter. So Koreans are able also to map this, and now the new TV commercials for the new soju, they use the kya sound, yeah? That's the one that seems lighter. Again, we thought this was a very quirky feature of Koreans, but when we put these audio files to people at the other side of the world who's never been to Korea or drank soju or anything, they were able not just to map which one sounds softer, but also they were able to map gender, so they were able to concur on what sound more female, and they also were able to concur on what type of the two sounds would go with a lighter soju beverage, and which one would go with the stronger one, so to say. So I think, it's just a counterpoint, because I agree, all languages have the same affordances, but also there are some specificities. But just for the sake of discussion, I think iconicity gives you the proof that there's also some, well, more commonly shared patterns that should also be bear into account.
Thank you. John, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, well, I just want to say yes to the question, and using neural correlates. When we are born, we have all the organs completely formed and functioning, as if we were adults, except for the brain. The brain is the only organ that is completed after birth. And when we are born, we have large masses of neurons, only a few connections, sensory motor circuitry is fully functional, but the rest is going to be formed through experience, which means that the brain is bioculturally determined. And therefore, yes, of course, language and culture will shape the connectivity. We know that connectivity is more important than activation of structures in the brain during creative performance, and therefore I have no data to show you, but to me the answer is for sure yes. Because culture and language will determine largely the ways that our structure are interconnected.
Thank you so much. I think it was really nice to hear sort of two sides of the argument, and also to think about some things that we sort of all might share as humans, but also some things that sort of differ between speakers of different languages. And I think it's the perfect time to start with the questions. Yes, Simon. It was the first hand.
It's quick on the trigger. Yeah.
Thank you very much to you all for this very inspiring and dynamic discussion. I have a question that's not related to creativity, but to a notion that you have all referred to, and in reference to Louis McNally's point yesterday about the language we use as an analyst, and sometimes from one tradition to the next we use the same term to mean something else. And we had a live example with valency, right? Andrew Gottlieb meant grammatical valency, whereas there's other kinds of valency. So this is my question to all four of you. I think we have all used that term about multimodality. We have you've talked about modality, but also about modes, right? So you individually, what do you understand by multimodality, and what is modality? What is a mode? Is it the same thing? Do you have just example? Yeah, it's not expecting you to have a very clear definition, but truly interested to know how you understand that term. Yeah.
How long do we have? Not too long.
It's a very relevant question, but very difficult to answer in one sentence. I guess depending from where you come from, you understand it in different ways. So I will just give my working definition, yeah, and the one we've been using, Janet and I, lately. Yeah, so we understand modes as modes of representation, like text, images, sounds, music, but then there is it's not a definite list. So you just, because then some people say, so we have sounds, but music is a sound, because it's an organized structure of sound, so there should be something else. And silence, is that a mode as well? Yeah, in some mediums it's more relevant than in others. So we use, well, since we're working with advertising, it's easier, so we just have images, text, and music. But yeah, it's not a finished list. And then you have multimodality, yeah, that was your other, so we understand that when more than one mode is involved, combined, like at the same time. And medium, it's something slightly different, yeah? Yeah, Mariana, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah.
Otherwise it becomes maybe a terminology thing. But then I think the idea maybe would be that, would you agree that mode refers more to the representation in the sense of the semiotic systems in which something is expressed, while modality recalls or evokes more perception, and so the senses through which something is perceived, the visual modality, so you can have a metaphor that is visual because it's perceived mostly through vision, but then it can be in the pictorial and the linguistic mode. So basically what you call multimodal metaphor, for example, I would call multimode,
Right.
because it involves different modes, but then you perceive it through your vision, and so it's visual. So that's the modality through which you perceive it, but the modes,
Okay.
maybe?
Simon, is there something you want to add? Yes, I can see you whispering.
Well, maybe I misunderstood, but I understood the answer from Paula completely differently. To what a mode, according to you, Paula, is, you said text, music, right? But you didn't say sensorial modality. You didn't say vision or touch. That's something, it's not in your definition of mode, right? Yeah, okay. That would be your understanding of modality, Mariana. Yeah, okay. Yeah, just play it right.
So you see, yeah, this is our life.
Yeah, but not semiotic systems. Semiotic systems could be language, right? But language can be heard, but it can be read, right? So it can be accessed by different sensorial modalities. Okay, yeah.
Elizabeth, do you want to add something on this? Sorry. Is this
It was not an excuse to get the microphone, actually.
Mariana, is this still the same question, or
No.
Okay, the next one. Okay, we ready to switch to the next one? Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to make a comment, actually. When you talk about computer-generated metaphors, I think it's worth and fair to mention that you showed some examples, and that all of the Twitter bots and the computer, most of those that you showed come from a group in Dublin led by Tony Will, who is one of the founders of the group Computational Creativity. And we have here, I know you're going to cringe in your chair, but we have here one of the brilliant brains who actually programmed the Twitter bots and the machine to then generate the metaphors. That's Phil, he's there. He's a PhD student of Tony. And so my question is that, where is the creativity and where is the intentionality in this process? Is it in him, who programs the machine to come up with metaphors, or is it in the machine?
Go, Phil.
He should answer.
Yeah, I think that was exactly our point. Where is the intentionality? And often it might not, well, it's always going to be somewhere with this, but yeah, in Tony and Phil, the people designing it and putting together but then again, what they were intending wasn't actually the metaphor, so it's not direct. It's just that the creativity in terms of how those metaphors are produced, is kind of one step removed from someone thinking, I'm going to produce a creative metaphor. I think that's where we're kind of getting away from the idea, like, there is ever a situation where someone thinks, I'm going to produce a creative metaphor, and they produce one. And that, but sometimes when you look at the studies of metaphor, there seems to be that kind of assumption behind the idea of creative metaphor. We're kind of trying to get away from that whole idea of where on earth is the intentionality. But it's great to know that you're in the audience.
Yeah, exactly. Herb? And then Nancy.
Can I just have a follow-up comment?
Well, since he's here, I wonder, I mean, we're talking, so you meant, your question was, where's the intentionality? And I would add, but the intentionality for what? Because it might be that Tony Beale, I'm not sure what the intention was, but my insight was that the intention is to generate metaphors computationally, which doesn't necessarily have to be the same as generating metaphors that look like as if produced by humans. Am I wrong? Or no? So I guess, of course, they're intentional. Yeah, we should have perhaps framed that better. Everything is intentional. I think even the lack of intention is an intention per se. But the thing is, what type of intention is behind the generation of these metaphors?
Before we continue to Herb and then Susan, Phil, do you want to say something? Can we get a microphone, please? Sorry.
Thank you. Especially when you mentioned the Turing test as a different example. This were like in the computational creativity community, there's this argument that the Turing test should not be used for investigating creative artifacts done by machine because it restricts the creative horizon to like human creativity. And as you said, the intentionality there would be as well restricted if we just look at it like who is the programmer, who does the program, right? But what we actually want is to observe something that comes from a novel sort of creativity, right? Machine creativity in that sense.
Is it true? Yeah, because I read about it. So the Turing test can be faked with machine learning techniques.
I mean, it depends on how you phrase it, right? If you just let a human observe the output, then you forget about all the intentionality, about all the framing that the machine also can provide in some sense. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
In our study, the metaphors passed the Turing test.
First of all, thank you for a very lively, wonderful discussion all around. One particular piece I really noted with interest was the piece about modality and multimodality that again just cropped up in the questioning, and in particular two sort of different ways in which modes can be affording different kinds of creativity. So if a mode is, or a medium is wide open, so high bandwidth, if you will, that allows all kinds of creativity because there's very few constraints. On the other hand, if a mode or a medium it has a lot of constraints to it, it's almost as if it's a Venturi tube and creativity can burst through on the other side. We've seen this with the explosion of abbreviations and other sorts of things with texting. Force people to use a little tiny keyboard to find ways to be super creative on the outside. So what I think is particularly interesting is the commentary about how when you blend these two things, that's where you maximize creativity. But I'm wondering what your comments would also be about when you sequence them. Because one thing I just recently discovered in my middle-aged years are silent movies, which are, of course, gone these days, but they have developed this incredible art form of show a visual image and develop ambiguity and tension, and then pause a moment, and then show a textual piece of discourse or just a description to disambiguate things. And then they can do it the other way around, so show some discourse and text. You wonder what's going on, and then they can disambiguate it with the scene itself, and they could play with those back and forth. And I think there's been a creative art form completely lost when we stopped having a silent films when, of course, we could put sound in movies. So your thoughts about that?
So it's kind of like necessity is the mother of invention idea, and and the more the constraints, the more the creativity. I suppose the other way with combining the different modes of expression or mediums of expression, not sure which one to say. You do that in a way as well. You also, if you multiply constraints, then you limit the constraints as well. So therefore, in a way, that's another way of leading to more creativity.
Is there anybody else who would like to answer this question?
Can you just add just one comment?
That's an interesting thought, because inside of movies there is a new dimension, which is time. So not all the information is available from the beginning. And I think that makes it even more interesting, the fact that it's not just, well, I'm not going to get into mode or modality anymore, but still, it's not just the sounds and images and moving images and text, it's also the fact that not all the information appears first. Yeah, so the fact that you're elaborating on that metaphor, extending that metaphor, that makes it even more interesting. Yeah, because this is like a non-line dynamic construction. Yeah, so thank you so much for that.
Susan? Susan and then Rachel.
Yeah, I just would like to ask you a question that I think a lot about and struggle with, working with language learners, and your idea of spotting fake metaphors. What's the borderline between metaphorical creativity and error? So if we have Jeanette as an L1 speaker of British English who says something that's incredibly creative, we're all bowled over and think she's amazing, but then we can have a learner of English who says the exact same thing and says, no honey, you can't say that, that's not what we do. So where's the borderline? Just your thoughts on that.
That's exactly yeah. That's exactly kind of behind a lot of what we're thinking, because there are those studies, aren't there, indeed, that show if people think the metaphor is produced by a non-native speaker, it's not deemed to be as creative. So I think that's kind of like the idea there is like the creativity is in the eye of the beholder. And I don't know what else we can add to that. I don't think we can say for sure it's here, and you produced a creative metaphor, but you didn't. It's sort of in the air. It doesn't belong to anyone, but if anything, it belongs to the beholder.
And should we finish? Unfortunately, well, let's see. Rachel, please, and then we'll see how much time we have left. Over to you.
Thank you very much for all this discussion. So it just made me think why we're talking just about creativity in the field of metaphors, because we can be creative in all kinds of issues, especially in language, which we control, and which can be very creative even if it's literal. So I'm going to repeat myself. I don't know if you've heard it, but in 2004 we came up with an article about creativity and pleasure, which didn't really focus on metaphors but on creativity in general. And what we showed was that the creativity is graded. So if you just change something slightly, it's not creative. And the example that we used was like a piece of paper. So a piece of paper is something conventional. And then if you want to change it a little bit, then you say something like a single piece of paper. So it's not a change that is creative, it's just a change, but it's not pleasing. And then we went on and said something like a piece of paper, P-E-A-C-E. And of course it echoes the piece of paper, and therefore you understand that if you say a piece of paper, and this was actually political, then you actually say that the peace agreement, this is something that I've mentioned earlier, that a peace agreement eventually is just a piece of paper and it doesn't really work. So this is something that is called optimal innovation. And then if you try harder and come up with a pill of pepper, which is something entirely new, this is pure innovation, and it's not entertaining. So there is this kind of optimal innovation that we should be looking for, rather than just anything, because it's not really arbitrary. There is a certain point which really would do the job, whether it's literal or metaphorical. So metaphor is not necessarily so unique, just one option.
Thank you for your comment. I think, unfortunately, does anybody want to say anything?
We found that in our computer. We found that in the computer-generated metaphor study, the optimally innovative ones were by far the most appreciated. So yeah, we realise it appreciates across the board, but and we found support for that in the metaphor study as well.